Hello, welcome to this video where I decided that I needed to create an update to one of my popular videos from over 10 years ago relating to knee pain and VMO strength, and a lot of people subscribe to the channel from those videos, and some of the things I did back then, obviously with time you improve things. So I wanted to have this video that sort of like included some of the things I didn't do back then that I do now. Interestingly, though, the concept or the process that I follow is pretty similar. It's just some of the things I might use within it is different. So previously I had 5 steps. Now I would almost say it's 7. Although you could almost merge a couple together, but I'm going to run through it really quickly just to give you an idea of what I do. So in the first video we discussed like mobility being the first one. And one of the stretches that I didn't use then that I do now is this ankle stretch, where I'm using the band around the ankle. This is very, very useful. I use this a lot with all types of foot and ankle injuries as well, but very much so with the knee, because it becomes a real problem if there's a loss of dorsiflexion here at the knee, and you'll never be able to get the full knee flexion here, meaning you'll never be able to develop full strength through the quadricep and especially the VMO, because it will never get in the positions when you need to stand up and where it really delivers the most strength and the most control. You won't be able to get there because of the ankle. This banded stretch is excellent because it really helps to free the ankle up, gives it more stability, allowing you to get that dorsiflexion as opposed to just an ordinary calf stretch as such. So that'd be one of the first things I'd be always using a lot with anyone with knee pain. Obviously, if they have adequate dorsiflexion, I probably won't use it as much, but it's very common to see that a problem at the ankle, even if it has no pain. This is one of the things I did use back in the original video, which is foam rolling. I won't go into too much detail about this. Make sure you check the description underneath, because if you want to see more detail about specific exercises here and other ones that are similar that I might use, you can check that out. But obviously I still keep some of this foam rolling. For some people it's not useful, but for others it's really useful. I could foam roll around the glutes like Dylan's doing here, even through the quadriceps themselves can develop nasty trigger points. So, because there might be incredible stiffness even though it's weak. So, you can really experiment a lot through the foam roll, and really getting into the hip flexor of the TFL, which Dylan's doing around here. Sort of it's more to the front of the hip. Sort of around the side and the front of the hip can be a real problem muscle, hard to stretch at times. So finding various ways to mobilize it before you attempt any strengthening is really important. And it's something that a lot of people just miss. They're just looking for strengthening things, but really neglecting the fact that muscle inhibition was very easily created, which means that a tight muscle will inhibit weak ones from firing. So tight hips always create problems at the glutes, and weak glute problems always create problems at the knee. So they're all intimately related. So assessing yourself in various ways. So again, check the description. You want to see assessments. I've provided detailed video and articles on this, how to do that. So here's another. This is more of a posterior chain stretch, so more for the glutes than say the TFL itself. But again, you see a lot of problems through being unable to get the body in the correct positions, especially when we do things like the deadlift, which is one of the key exercises for knee pain. All right, so this next one is like just a basic quadricep stretch. So I've always preferred this version here with the Swiss ball, where you try to sit upright, and Dylan just loses his balance here a bit, but trying to get in this position where the knee's fully flexed and you're getting the stretch through the anterior part of the hip as much as the knee itself. Just doing that standing quadricep stretch is not as effective, because you'll only get the bottom part of the knee and not really get the hip involved. So I've always found this stretch to be way more effective. And a bit like the ankle thing, I've always found it to be a real problem with anyone with knee pain. So just getting in that position there where Dylan's sitting quite upright, and obviously the leg would have minimal gap at the back here. All right. So these are one of the few the key things that I did do in the first video. There's just the ankle thing was probably the major difference in some of the things I did there. So now we'll move on to step 2. So step 2 in this video, which is what I didn't include in the original one 10 years ago, is the Romanian deadlift. Now, I bring this in really early, even before the isolated strengthening, which sounds crazy, but this is one of the key exercises in learning to use their hip correctly. As I briefly touched on a second ago, poor hip control, poor hip mechanics, poor hip alignment all create issues at the glute, and then without this glute firing correctly and without the adequate mobility of the hips, you'll never be able to get control in the single leg stance where we see all the patella femoral problems and ACL tears from poor alignments of the knee, because you just can't control it. So very early on, I'm teaching people, same with back pain, I'm teaching people how to do this position of correct bending where they're keeping spinal alignment in neutral, pelvic position in neutral, and learning to get good control. And they can really, to be honest, this exercise usually gives them a lot of relief. It's very, very relieving on the hamstrings actually get quite involved in tightening, but they have to be lengthened. All right, so this is where a person with a posterior tilt, always using their knees too much, they're overusing the quadriceps. They're quadricep dominant because they can never get in these hip-loaded positions correctly because of the stiffness around the hip that's just sucking their butt under all the time. So I'm bringing this exercise in really early on because it sets the foundation upon all of the movements to follow, and especially if we're doing sports development where we're using fast cutting movements and things like that, where I need to have that hip position executed perfectly. All right, so step 3, which is another thing I didn't include, so this sort of the step 2 and 3 in this video are probably the 2 biggest changes from what I didn't include years ago. And I did briefly do them at times, but I maybe at that time didn't give them the respect that I probably started to develop for them over the years. And this is foot stability. So really bringing in, having a higher emphasis on what's happening at the big toes, as we're watching Dylan here use a band to try and create good foot positioning and then also working on big toe mobility itself. So wearing little toe spreaders or using bands like this to make sure that the toes are spread evenly, so there's no bunions forming and there's no rigidity of the toes. Rigidity of the toes will ruin foot stability. And foot stability, if you don't have an adequate amount, because it's like shock absorbers to the kinetic chain, it places enormous stress through the knee, especially the knee's really going to cop it, because you just can't absorb the impact of walking and especially running and jumping and things like that. Now, that first exercise with the band was just to provide good toe placement. This is sort of an exercise we use to encourage the toe to be dorsiflex. So you can sort of see here where it's bent up and we're just creating this walking action and forcing the big toe into flexing, which it is meant to do normally. Quite often with knee pain people, we see this is really dysfunctional, quite rigid. So using various exercises like this, these aren't the only ones, but this is just to give you an idea of how I would use this in the process of improving and working through things variously. So it's not just one stupid VMO exercise on a leg extension machine or something like that. And you can see here Dylan's trying to work on his toe mobility in isolation. So I'm just asking him to lift his big toe up off the ground without any of the other toes. And you can see it's a bit of a battle for him to do that. He can do it, but he probably needs to be a little bit better than that. Knee pain people obviously probably don't even get any movement at all. All right, which is something I see quite a lot. So this is where you want to really work on that in the early stages, because you're going to need this stability, as you'll see shortly, to create single leg stability. And as I mentioned earlier, single leg stability is where we see all the patellofemoral problems really come to a surface, and the knee getting torqued and twisted sideways and laterally, creating enormous shearing forces. All right, so then you can use things like this balance beam sort of walking. Again, that's not the only way to do it. There's many other ways to improve foot stability, but these are some of the really best ones. where you got these backward walking. It's a lot of proprioception. There's a lot of core involvement as well. But the foot stability demands are incredible. And there's no way you can do this if you don't have that adequate alignment through the whole kinetic chain. If any sort of thing goes, the whole body gets thrusted sideways and you fall over all the time. So there's no pain or danger from doing this wrong. It's just extremely frustrating if your stability sucks, all right, which is what you'll need to work on in order to control the more loaded movements to come, where you want to really develop your strength to its full potential. All right, so always remember, so this is probably where the process of what I had years ago is the same, where I worked on mobility, stability, strength, and then power. And strength was sort of broken into two parts, like isolated strength and then integrated strength. All right, now this one is a very simple stability drill where we're just working with minimal knee flexion, not a great deal, because remember, it won't take a lot for a person with knee pain to feel it. And we're just working around this in a circle, so trying to maintain that stance legs stability. It's not about trying how deep you get, it's just about can it control its alignment while you're working in multiple directions. So we started forward, then sideways, diagonally sideways, and then now backwards, and even around the back, diagonally backward around the other side. All right, so this is a great drill that you can work on for stability before you're turning it into strength exercise. And again, barefoot is best here because you're really encouraging this foot stability working in combination with the hip. And you can see in this one here, this lateral movement, we often see a lot of issues on that one where they just can't maintain this alignment. The knee just sort of drifts in as this leg's taking the body this way. The stance leg basically follows it and ends up in this position, and that's where you're getting all the problems through the knee. But it really could have been the foot collapsing inward, or it could have been the glutes failing and pulling the femur inwards. All right, either way, you're going to have issues. All right, so these are some of the simple drills that follow on from the mobility and the Romanian deadlift that we did earlier. All right, and then this sets a nice platform for us to start to work into the strength phase, which is the next thing to come. And there's a couple of variations of what I use in that these days from what I did 10 years ago. All right, so we'll have a look at those now. All right, so the next part of the strength phase is really the isolated strength phase, and this is where I might use hip extensions. Again, a very nice relieving exercise for someone with knee pain. It feels quite good because they're not loading their knee for a change. They're just loading the hip, a bit like the Romanian deadlift earlier. This is where we're just loading the hip and the hamstrings and glutes. But this time we're going into single legs. So before we really try to load it up a lot, we're going to just work through its stability. Now, I like this test, this here, exercise here, because it's very much like a test, and you're trying to see if the pelvis is going to have any lateral shifting. So if she lifts this leg, does it usually the side that she's lifting, that side will collapse. All right, and you'll see that that they can't keep good pelvic control. You might even see hamstrings cramping up. The hamstrings cramping up if the glutes aren't strong enough just to do this simple exercise. And remember, if they're quadricep dominant, that's quite often the case. All right. So this is a really simple exercise you could use early on that starts to get you into the strengthening phase. So all the things I've used so far, I might be using all together at the same time. I'm not really just doing just the stretches. I'm doing that straight away following up the Romanian deadlift and then all these other various things. It just depends on the person's skill level, their pain level, where they're at with everything on how much I do. But once I've gone from the floor, I want to get into the standing thing, and this is where I might bring in the little crab walk exercise. Again, I don't want to make it a squat. I want to make it more of a bending movement and just getting them to adduct the hips. So it's a bit like the clam exercise, which I used in the earlier video from 10 years ago. I found this one's a little bit more effective, sort of gets a little bit more, because the clams can sort of wind up the hips with some people. I find this one just gets a little bit more muscle involved. Makes it a little bit easier for them to execute it, but it also more functional. It gets me moving forward quicker through the program, so I can get to the things that are going to make the bigger impact long term. All right, so that using these small micro bands are really handy and people again really can feel their glutes working and learning to gain control of the alignment of the knee, and that's really the secret to the whole thing. All right, now this is one of the exercises I've added in more recent times. Quite an isolated, remember this is the isolated strengthening phase, so this again, all of these have a real heavy emphasis on glute control or foot control. Because they're simple, it's probably more hip control. All right, and this is where I'm just using a knee extension movement, so this is probably the first one that's really looking more like a VMO type movement that, or isolated exercise people are familiar with, but we're really turning it into a glute exercise. And this is where you just got that band trying to pull the tibia outwards, which would ruin the alignment, so pull you into knee valgus. We've got the micro band trying to work on the femur, pulling it inward. So we've got like two things happening at once. And obviously the knee extension is where the quadriceps working, but they're only in a very small scale because it's only your own body weight. It's nowhere near enough to create enough strength, but it's more about controlling alignment in this sort of basic phase to prepare us for the more difficult things to come. All right, so that's one of the more, I don't use it with everyone. It's just some people that it can be quite effective sort of exercise to use. All right, so now once we've got out of that stage, now we're going to move into the more integrated type of movements, and this is where we're going to see Dylan completing some of the squatting sort of movements. So let's have a look at those. Okay, so in this integrated strengthening phase, this is, now I'm only using body weight here, but really I probably want to by this point I should be bringing in some load of some kind, but before I do that I need to be sure that the technique is correct. So the squat can be obviously a real problem next movement because it really starts to bring the knee involved, so it can be a very painful or often a trigger of the pain itself, but if done correctly, it's actually going to be one of the ones that helps to correct it. All right, so you're really making sure that they've got adequate alignment control, the range of motion. You want to have this sort of parallel lines with the tibia and the spine, so the knees should be going over the toes. That's where you're really getting good quadricep activation in this. All right, so very simple. So again, you can check the description below to see the weighted variations that I may use, and again it depends on the person, but just for the sake of this video, not going for 2 hours, just to give you an idea of what we look for. Then the lunge, there's a different pattern again, so there's sometimes where we might see issues with the trailing leg, so it's not actually the front leg, it's the lack of flexibility on the trailing leg, and that's where that stretch from earlier with the Swiss ball behind us becomes important. So if there's issues with flexibility through the anterior hip or the quadricep itself, you'll see issues with the lunge, and then it might be actually because of the lack of flexibility here makes them fall forward into this leg, so that you'll create pain in this leg because they can't actually get in the right spot because of the back leg. All right, so it could be a lot of things going on with the lunge, but you really need to be working through that, and you could be doing these just one at a time. Sometimes you may start with the lunge, sometimes you may start with the squat. It just depends on the person. All right, but really important exercises to build that strength back up. And you can see how really easily he controls that alignment. That's a perfect lunge right there, and hence Dylan doesn't have knee pain. All right, then after that one is when you really get into the tricky stuff. Now you start to working in your single leg movements. So we looked at the single leg hip extension and the single leg, leg extension with the tubing. Now this is where we've got their single leg squat. Now this is probably the hardest of the movements to get right. So this is definitely not one you would be doing early on. The toe touch drill had nowhere near the range of this. Toe touch drill was probably more hip loaded movement, very, very minimal range, more about the stance phase stability. This is more about stance phase strength. All right, so you can see how he controlled the alignment really well there. If I just take that back, you'll see how easily he controls that. You can see, well, that's a perfect alignment. All right, so there's no deviation with the foot or the hip in any of this movement here. You can see as he goes down, look at that, that's perfect. It doesn't get much better than that. All right, and that's why I have great depth, great control. You'll be able to do a lot with this movement. All right, so from a side-on perspective, you'll see how upright he is because there's a single leg deadlift variation that I use of this. And you'll see how he's really loading the knee here deliberately. All right, so we're trying to get strength into the quadriceps as much as the glutes. All right, So this is the ultimate of the single leg sort of stance face. And you see here's very similar angles to the squat with 2 legs. All right, you'll see in a minute the single leg deadlift's a lot different. All right, so this is a lot harder for people to complete. Very rarely do you need to load it. Body weight is usually hard enough for most people. All right, so once I've got through that one, then I might try the variations of all the single leg deadlifts. All right, so this is where we can really start to manipulate bringing in rotation, also that like forcing that knee to fall inwards again. All right, so this is where we use this deadlift variation called a hip airplane, and I've done videos on this recently describing that, but it's a good one because it sort of it basically tries to get the body to get lazy and roll inward. And so again, it's all about this stance phase leg staying really perfectly aligned, and the glutes on that side really staying strong, while this leg in the air, it has to be actually mobile and free itself up to rotate around. All right, so it's quite a clever exercise in really gaining great hip control and also foot control. So if you're doing this barefoot, this is again where you see the foot stability really become a factor, because if he loses foot stability, he loses the entire movement. Very, very frustrating exercise for many people, but highly effective. All right, and I think I just get him to do it on the other side facing the camera here, so you can see what happens if that knee, how you can really see it wobbling around more so than he did with the single leg squat where he had his eyes at the front. This is very much proprioception, and even though he doesn't have knee pain, this is still hard work for him. All right, you see how watch how the knee drifts inward right there, and he's trying to correct that. All right, that's why this is an excellent exercise for VMO and glutes, because it really forcing them to engage, and the foot as well. All right, so you're really getting everything that you need in the one movement. All right, so the last phase of all this is when I bring in bands back into the equation again, and this is where we call this reactive neuromuscular training, and that just basically means we're trying to feed mistakes into the system. So this is where we start to bring in the band on these various exercises we've just done, and really trying to make the body screw them up. So instead of just applying the logical thing of just a dumbbell with downward resistance, we're trying to create lateral resistance, because we know that's the problem that the knee has. It doesn't control lateral forces. So we bring in more lateral forces to force the body to adjust and adapt and improve. And you see here Dylan, he's got good control right until right at the end, and he loses it. So this is where we've got it just under the knee, pulling the tibia outward, which if you pull the tibia outward, it will pull the femur inward. All right, so you can see here he has to just really got this battle going on. Right at that point there, you see his foot is the one that left the ground there, so his ankle is the one that gave up on him there. All right, but he was doing quite a good job. If it's too hard, you just take a bit of resistance off. But he's got great alignment there, and right at this point, that's where the VMO right there is working really hard with the glutes and the foot. So all three things that we need. And the brain is working hard, because look where his eyes are. His eyes aren't even looking at what he's doing. So he has to go by feel. That's why it's a great proprioceptive exercise. All right, so I can apply this band to nearly all of those integrated strength movements, the squat and the lunge. And I did do that in the video from 10 years ago, just not with the same variations of the one that I've just done now and some of the others. But it's where if I have the band around above the knee, I'll be pulling the femur inward, as opposed to what we did with the last one, pulling the tibia outward. All right, so now we're just going back to that basic lunge and basic squat movement. This is where I could have dumbbells or a barbell on his back. I really got this band with this lateral force on it at the same time. All right, so we could have downward pressure with lateral resistance at the same time. And if you're at that point, it's fair to say knee pain's pretty much a thing of the past, and you're just making sure that you're strong enough that it never returns. And if you're playing sports, you're probably in that point where you're preparing to do jumping and agility type things that really test at a high speeds, because that would be the next phase, is really taking things to that high speed part. So we just saw him do a lunge. This is where we might have the banded resistance, so we could have a barbell on his back, or he's holding a dumbbell. And we just got that injured knee really being pulled quite heavily inwards to make him lose control, lose alignment, so that his muscles react and respond and do the right thing. All right, so that'd be the entire process of the video that I did from 10 years ago. So just to finish off, probably the key to this whole thing was probably what we did in the beginning. The sort of Romanian deadlift and the foot stability and some of the hip mobility things. They're the things that usually get people out of pain quickly. And then it's the things at the end that are the hip airplane things. This one here. They're the ones, and then that really sort of tie it all together. But they're obviously hard to get to early on, so you can't do them too soon. And then at the end with the banded stuff, so you're doing these sort of ones, that's where you're really getting the full maximum benefit of the VMO sort of strength training. So summing up, that'd be the 7 sort of steps I would be following, and really probably highlighting the big part of it, or the big key factors that in my opinion, or my experience of working with over 1,000 different knee pain cases, found to be the most effective for almost everyone that I see. There's just some are going to be more mobility problem based, other might be more stability problem based. So it might be skewed more in favour of one or the other, but at the end it always comes back to controlling these key movements standing up. If they can do, then they sort of quickly get back to where they need to be. All right, and then the strengthening phase, you just need time. Then you could have all the right exercises, but you can't rush the process. It just takes time to develop strength, especially if the pain's been there for some time. All right, so I hope you've enjoyed that 2022 review of the video from 10 years ago, and you get some good ideas, and it helps you out with your training and gets you pain-free and back to what you want to do. All right, I hope to see you on our next video, and I hope you enjoyed that.